evening, Melbourne. Good evening, Steve. Not good evening, Brendan, but welcome to another episode of Sunday Night Live. Live here from lockdown Melbourne. Good to see you, Steve. He doesn't seem to be able to hear me at the moment. Can you hear me, Steve?
Great to be here, Father Nick.
There we go.
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Thanks very much. For those of you who are watching for the first time, you're very welcome. For those of you tuned in expecting to see Brendan and are bitterly disappointed, a very sorry thing to say that Brendan's not here this evening, but we have replaced him. We've brought in a very firm replacement in Steve Lawrence, who may be known to many of you, but who has been a stalwart here of the Catholic scene for many years. But because, of course, this week we're starting our special a week-long anniversary of World Youth Day Rome in the year 2000, 20 years this week. And that was, Steve, when the first time I ever met you, actually. I still remember sort of sitting on a bus after getting off a Egypt Air flight, a 16-year-old schoolboy and this big, tall ex-AFL footballer getting on and talking about Jesus and just being completely sort of flabbergasted and not quite sure what I'd got myself into as I landed at World Youth Day in Rome. But it's good to have you with us tonight.
Great to be here, Father Nick. It's amazing to think that it's 20 years since the Great Jubilee year and that incredible World Youth Day, which really, I think, for many, really put the World Youth Day on the map in Australia. There had hardly been any group. I think maybe Wagga had taken a couple of groups in prior to 2000, but Melbourne, we took a group in 1997. I was still playing footy with Hawthorn at that time, so I didn't go. But I remember when I was working in youth ministry with Archbishop Pell at the time, 96, and he said, I want to take a group to World Youth Day. And so we managed to scrub together a group fairly quickly for that following year, 97. But the real priority, I mean, with the Great Jubilee year 2000, he really wanted to, he kept saying, we want to get 400, we're going to take 400. That's what I kept saying to people. I didn't, and it actually ended up being 400. So 200 went to the Holy Land first, and then 200 directly to Rome, of which you were one. There were other 16, a handful of 16-year-olds, quite a few of them. It was an extraordinary pilgrimage.
I think before we get attacked in the comments, it wasn't the first pilgrimage, as you said, for the Archdiocese of Melbourne. There had been a group that had gone previously to Paris, a much smaller group, but it was, as you're saying, the first of this next generation. And Cardinal Pell, then the Archbishop of Melbourne, and this was the reason I went. He actually approached every Catholic school and said, I want you to send 2 students. So all of these schools who had never sent students before had a reason to send someone. And that was why I found myself on the pilgrimage. So you were just saying you were working there at the time. What was your first, I suppose, impression of the idea of going to a World Youth Day and taking a group of 400 people?
Well, I was very, very excited to the fact that we might get 400. As I was saying, you know, the Cardinal was saying we've got to try and get 400. So we were really pushing it. By that time, I'd been involved in youth ministry for 4 years in the diocese, and we had great staff working in a team there with Mark Florio and Anna Schnardic and priests like Father Paul Stewart and Father Colin Ollerenshaw, and we had a fantastic team. But the Cardinal made a point of taking a group of about perhaps a dozen priests and I think 3 or 4 bishops. And so we had quite an incredible group also of small group leaders, about 30 of them, many of whom have very significant responsibilities in the diocese and in communities and movements. And so the quality of people who were leading the group were outstanding. I remember going to the Holy Land, though, the 200 of us that went to the Holy Land. You know, I'd never been to the Holy Land before, and like you're saying, I think the idea of actually taking a group to the World Youth Day, John Paul II was such a magnetic figure, and had been so important, certainly for me personally. So the idea of actually going to Holy Land and then Rome and being there with what ended up being 2 or 3 million, I forget the figures, 2.3 million, I think, was just simply remarkable. I've got three key things that I remember about the Holy Land. I remember being very, very struck by how we made a point of making sure that every place we went, each day we had a mass. And even though it was a busy pilgrimage, we tried to make sure we had at least half an hour, maybe 45 minutes after mass where people could just sit in silence. And if they had to, they could go wandering for a while, but they knew that it was a real chance to stop and pray. And there were many, many people who discovered the sacrament of confession and really personal, deep personal prayer in silence. And I think that was one of the secrets of the success. There were many, many conversions that took place during that time. But there were also lots of fun moments. We had a day at a water slide, and a lot of people remember the Cardinal and Bishop Joe Grech, of substantial size in their own ways, sliding down this water slide. That was one of the big memories. But also, for example, Gary Pinto singing a song in the prison underneath the house of Caiaphas, where Jesus spent the night, and it was just absolutely extraordinary. You could remember, everyone could feel the hair on the back of their neck. It was just beautiful from Gary, and those were just some of the moments. But of course, then it was getting to Rome, and that was where the whole world were gathering together for this great Jubilee year with John Paul II. That was extraordinary.
And I found some photos this afternoon of sort of some of those big gatherings in Rome, over 1 million people in the middle of Roman summer. The heat, I can just remember the heat. I can remember the crowds, and I can remember the public transport not working. And I suppose one of my fondest memories, though, was of my small group leaders. One day we were supposed to be going to the catechesis site. It was just obvious that we were never going to get there. So my small group leader sat down and gave us catechesis on the train station platform. So again, that witness of his faith and so many like him. Steve, you've been to lots of World Youth Days, and each one of them sort of takes on a slightly different character. So Rome was incredibly hot, for instance. But one of the things that John Paul II in founding World Youth Days made sure was that they all had a number of sort of key elements. For someone who hasn't been to a World Youth Day, perhaps, can you share with us what some of those things are and why you think now St. John Paul II thought that they were so important?
Well, yeah, he previously had experience of taking young groups, on camps and gathering them together and giving them solid teaching as well as experience.
The wonders of the internet here. Seems that I might still be live and Steve Lawrence isn't live anymore. So I'm just going to, while we sit here, just give him a quick disconnect and get him to reconnect himself if he can. But otherwise you might have to put up with me this evening. The beauty of broadcasting live. We've been having a few problems all afternoon. Well, we've been having problems pretty much since whenever we started this podcast. So I'm going to finish off what Steve was saying. So we were just talking about the fact that although World Youth Day has taken different forms in many different countries around the world, John Paul II was very key on ensuring that World Youth Day always had a couple of composite elements, a couple of those being fundamentally catechesis, education in the faith, time of Eucharistic adoration, silence, and also obviously that great pilgrimage walk. So there's a really great sort of solidarity amongst all World Youth Day pilgrims because they have in many ways had very similar experiences, even though they may have been to very different World Youth Days. We might just give Steve one last try to get back in and see how he's going there. There he is. Are you there?
I'm back.
Okay, I just
Can you hear me again?
Yeah, we can hear you. I just finished the answer to my own question. So you've been to 6 World Youth Days across across the years. But I suppose one that I can imagine holds a very special place in your heart is World Youth Day Sydney 2008, where you were involved in catechesis. And in that really important element I was just talking about of growing in knowledge of the faith, especially for young people today. Is there any advice you could give to them about sort of how they can grow in their own faith, even if they don't get to go to a World Youth Day?
Yes. Yeah, catechesis was one of the areas of my responsibility at the Sydney World Youth Day. As Director of Evangelisation and Catechesis, there was all the pastoral, I guess, spiritual dimension of it, including major events. And I think, catechesis is a crucial element of discovering faith. I think it needs to be people need to have an experience of faith. They need to have an encounter with God in order for them to be open and pondering those questions. Although people come differently, sometimes catechesis can open up that experience. But I think in terms of evangelization of young people, we need to find a whole lot of ways to help them make that experience in order for them to be open to the teaching in the first place. But, God works in amazing ways. But certainly once that experience has been made and once there's a search that's genuine and people are accompanied by, those of faith, you tend not to be able to do it alone. We need other people with us in some kind of small groups or communities or whatever, parishes, university chaplaincies. We need to be accompanied by other people whose faith kind of nurtures us. But I think the idea of actually going into, the teaching, understanding better in our minds to get real clarity. Jesus said it's the truth that sets you free. So we do need to have a disposition in our mind and also heart to be shaped by the truth and the truth that comes to us through the scriptures, through the magisterial teaching and the tradition, through reason and the lives of saints and art. All of these things need to be harnessed together in such a way that helps shape our understanding and reality of or perspective on reality around truth. So catechesis is a vital dimension. It's not everything. It's not enough, but it's extraordinary. It can't be avoided. It's essential. Yeah.
We were saying early on that really after World Youth Day Rome, the approach of the church in Australia to World Youth Day changed dramatically, and we saw dioceses taking large groups, and sort of subsequently for the last 20 years, there's been pilgrimage groups that have attended every of the major World Youth Days. You've been to most of them. Just before we bring in our special guest tonight, I want to take you through a rapid fire round really quickly. High point of World Youth Day. So high point of World Youth Day Rome.
Okay, for me, it was the Great Jubilee, the Holy Door. Going through that on the year 2000 was extraordinary.
Okay, then there was Toronto.
Toronto was actually, for me, it was the night, like the thunderstorm and the being drenched on the Saturday night, and then the clouds, opening when we were singing the Gloria at the beginning of the Mass on the Sunday. It seemed just miraculous.
Okay, Cologne.
Cologne was the pilgrim walk to the cathedral where we had the relics of the three kings. And for the group I was with, through the forest was simply spectacular. It was like I was in a medieval sort of mystery play, walking through, the forests of Cologne.
Beautiful. Now, it's going to be very hard for you to pick here, but what about a high point of World Youth Day Sydney?
Well, actually, having been to so many World Youth Days, Sydney, one of my highlights of Sydney was actually having my wife with me during the World Youth Day weekend. And so we did the walk together. We slept out under the stars together. And so to have Annie there was just such a beautiful gift. And for her, having made so many sacrifices to get me to other World Youth Days, to be able to actually have her experience it for herself was a huge joy.
Yeah. For me, World Youth Day Sydney, there's a couple of moments. I might talk about in a minute, but I think the Stations of the Cross, through the streets of Sydney, I think you were commentating or part of the commentary on that night, were you, Steve? Or you might have done some special comments on something?
No. Father Chris Bryan did that.
Oh, okay.
He did an amazing job, Father Chris Bryan.
I just remember just being absolutely gobsmacked by them. And they were designed by a Melbourne priest, now Monsignor Franco Cavara, who had a great history in the Australian Opera Company and is now a priest, a late vocation. But he did just a beautiful job putting those together. Okay, Sydney. Then there was Madrid, which was it was only about 2 years after Sydney, I think, wasn't it, or 3 years maybe?
2011. Madrid was 2011, and I had a group of ACU students that time. I've had different kinds of students. Had Sydney Uni before going with Cologne, and Emmanuel Community going to Toronto. So seemed to have different groups almost every time. Having the ACU students for Madrid was amazing. We probably it was the pre-pilgrimage in the footsteps of John Paul II, going to places like, Krakow and Auschwitz, on the way through to Rome, to Madrid, and that particular one was one of my highlights.
Then we had Rio, the beach.
I didn't get to Rio, but I got to Krakow.
Okay.
And the whole Divine Mercy theme was amazing for me. I loved going to that place and having that message extrapolated, and really the emphasis on John Paul II as well. I love that. It was like he was now Saint John Paul, and he was up there. That was extra. I also I was with a group from the Emmanuel Community, and we had a Eucharistic miracle that we visited on the way through. So to see the flesh of the Eucharist, in a kind of miraculous way, was extraordinary for me.
And what about Panama? Did you get to Panama?
No, I didn't get to Panama.
No,
I'm now 51. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to otherwise.
So either did I. Actually, we've both hit the too old for World Youth Day category finally. So, if you were at Panama and you're watching live tonight, make sure you put some comments in the comments box about your experience at Panama, because we were both obviously too old to be there. Just before we go to our special guest this evening, normally we have Brendan's top 5 each week, and he's not here tonight, obviously, so I'm going to do my top 5, and that will be my top 5 World Youth Days. And I've only been to 5, which means I'm going to do the thing that I've always sworn that I was never going to do, and that's I'm going to rank my pilgrimages. But I can only do it because, as those of you who listen regularly know, Brendan's top 5 is never a top 5. It's a group of 4 and then a top 1. So I'm going to loosely put my top 5 in the same sort of Brendan category. So number 5 would be Rio. And it wasn't because it was a bad World Youth Day, but something just had to be in number 5. But one thing that stood out for me, Steve, and I think your group might have done something similar. We went to Peru first, and a group from ACU I think was there at the same time, and we did some really great missionary work in Peru, and that was a really a wonderful binding experience for the pilgrims before we got to Rio. And we just spent, I think, 4 days in the end building these staircases in these Peruvian villages. So it was a real sort of memory for me. Number 4, Madrid. And again, these are all, it's pretty hard to put them in a ranking, but it was my first as a priest. So I suppose that's what I remember most about it, was that I'd found a vocation at a World Youth Day, and sort of 15 years later I went back, and I was the one hearing confessions, and I was the one leading the rosary on the bus, and I was the one doing all of those priestly things that I'd seen witnessed so strongly to me on my first World Youth Day as a young man. Then the top 3, it gets pretty tight and very hard to distinguish. But Krakow, I think, Steve, like you, I'd never been to Poland, and it was just such a rich experience, and obviously so close to the heart of St. John Paul II and the entire World Youth Day. It was like being at World Youth Day with John Paul II, and I hadn't been since my first one. All the others I'd been with Pope Francis or Pope Benedict. So it was like going back to being on World Youth Day with St. John Paul II, because everything had his sort of spirit, and everyone was talking about him and visiting all the places that he had been. So then I had to split hairs, and for you and me alike, Steve, that's a pretty hard job, between number 2 and number 1. So obviously there was my first World Youth Day, which was Rome. which was a life-changing experience. But I've put it in number 2 because I think it could only have been surpassed by World Youth Day Sydney. And I think for those of us who were lucky to be there, it was just a remarkable week of grace in our country. And I still just remember a couple of key things. I was talking about the Stations of the Cross, but I also just remember standing at Barangaroo on the night of the opening mass, and then again for the welcome of the Holy Father, and just thinking, wow, this is our country. Like, we haven't gone anywhere else. This is this thing that we see, this great gift to the church. We have seen everywhere else, but now it's here in our own country. And I was a young seminarian at that stage, and there was just a real sense of hope and joy for the future of the church here in Australia. So Sydney has to go at my number 1 spot. What about you, Steve? If I was going to ask you on the spot to put a number 1 World Youth Day, which would it be?
I think probably because it was my first and because it had such an extraordinary impact, not having had one before, I would say Rome was my favourite.
Yeah. So very good. Well, I suppose without any further ado, and let's not tempt the internet gods any further as we stretch the bandwidth of the Holy Family Presbytery internet connection once again, but we're really pleased this evening to be welcoming to the podcast probably the one man who has done more to bring World Youth Day to the life of the church in Australia, and in particular here, the church in Melbourne, than any other, and a man who's a great friend of the youth and the young people of the church. And that, of course, is Cardinal George Pell. So you're very welcome, Your Eminence, and we thank you so much for giving us your time this evening to be with us. I hope you can hear us and see us. There's quite a few. It was actually one of the first things I heard of when our group of school students got to Rome, and that was the story about an archbishop at that point going down a water slide, or being pushed down, or pushing others down a water slide. Was that true?
Slide, I sank immediately with a resounding thud. So it was a rather inglorious end, but I wasn't pushed down. I went down freely.
Of your own free will. That's good to hear.
Cardinal Pell, it's Steve Lawrence over here. I hope you can see me and hear me. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Look, so here we are. It's 20 years now since the World Youth Day 2000, and as we were saying before, you set out very boldly to say, let's take 400 to the Rome World Youth Day, and as I've mentioned, there were very few groups. I mean, we took a group in '97, but I think only Wagga had taken groups from a diocese prior to that. Mostly it was communities and movements and groups like Antioch, which had taken groups with Harvest and so on. Dioceses hadn't really taken on board. So what was it that motivated you to actually give such priority to the World Youth Day? What did you see in it? What did you see benefits it would bring to young people?
But the great challenge then and now is faith. Faith for the young people. All the sociological currents that used to help people, encourage people in the right direction, are now flowing more and more strongly against us. And World Youth Days strengthen the faith of the people. The great pioneer in Melbourne was Father Des Byrne at Oak Park. He had his confraternity of St. Michael, I think. I thought it was an extraordinary name. I didn't then know much about Leo XIII's vision. But at some stages, you can't imagine how bleak the youth scene and the faith scene was among young people back 25, 30 years ago. And I remember I was feeling particularly down, and he had just come back from Denver. And he phoned me up, and he was on fire with enthusiasm. And he said to me, "We're going to win. We're going to win." And I said, "What rubbish! We're struggling. It's too hard." No, 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 no. And although I didn't give him the courtesy of agreeing with him, I noted very much what he said. So I don't know quite why I couldn't get to Paris, although it was very soon after I was made Archbishop, but I was determined that the group would go. I remember before he resigned, Archbishop Little said to me, "How many do you think will go from Melbourne to," I think it was Paris? And I said, "Your Grace, I don't think anybody will, because the people you've got who you thought were encouraging them to go, I don't think they're interested." And so very few did go. We got the 400, as you've mentioned. I took particular care in the appointment of the priests who were to be leaders, and I took particular care on the care for the choice of the youth leaders. And as Steve has said, they were announced, both priests and youth leaders did outstanding work. I chose each priest for every particular occasion in the Holy Land, and I emphasized time and again that I wanted a thoroughly prepared, excellent sermon. And I set the bar by asking Father Desburn to speak at Mount Carmel. And he gave, I think, the sermon of a lifetime. And as he came back, Father Paul Stewart said to me as he passed, "Consummatum est. It's finished. I've done my bit." And that set the tone. One of the great highlights for all my times with World Youth Day was the wave after wave after wave of conversions in the Holy Land. Some people going back to confession 1, 2, or 3 times. It was the Holy Land's a wonderful place for a pilgrimage. It was a wonderful preparation because, like Father Nick and Steve, the 2 front runners for me are Sydney and Rome. And obviously, I can only choose Sydney, but Rome wasn't too bad either.
Your Eminence, by the time we got to Rome, St. John Paul II by that stage was quite elderly and frail, but you'd obviously known him before that. Can you share with us, I suppose, any memories you have of him as a priest, as a pope, as a friend?
Yes, I didn't know him as well as I came to know Pope Benedict, but I think you can make a considered, almost forensic case to claim that he's the greatest pope in history. Certainly, there's been Leo the Great, Gregory the Great, outstanding church leaders, semi-political leaders, the establishment of the Papal States. But he moved on such an immense canvas in 2 basic areas. He was an essential link in the peaceful overthrow of communism, the liberation of Eastern Europe, tremendous achievement with the help, we had Thatcher and Reagan and the union leader from Solidarity, and even Gorbachev didn't fight. But equally important, I think, for us was that Pope John Paul II stabilized the situation in the Western Church, where there was a bit of a flight from the gospel. There's a danger that it's recommencing. And he steadied the waters, returned us to Christ, returned us to the apostolic tradition. He was a great pope. I stood next to him at Cologne at the Mass, and sometimes his Masses were quite noisy. Benedict improved that. They kept shouting during the Eucharistic prayer, JP2, JP2, and every time the crowd said that, I heard him mutter to himself, Jesus Christ. He was a great man, as I said, one of the, if not the greatest Pope in history. It was an absolute privilege for all of us to have had him for so long as the successor of Peter.
Cardinal, you mentioned Pope Benedict and that you got to know him better, having obviously been, cardinal with him and so forth. And it was he who was the one who came to the World Youth Day in 2008 in Sydney. When did you first think about actually wanting to have a World Youth Day in Sydney? And what was it that made you do it? Like, what considerations did you have to make in thinking about preparing a World Youth Day?
Well, I began thinking about World Youth Day as soon as I became Archbishop of Melbourne. So Ted Axel, the business manager in Melbourne, said the best thing that ever happened to Melbourne was that I went to Sydney, and Sydney had to pay for the World Youth Day. I've answered the first question already, was to strengthen the faith. Strengthen the faith of the young people. I mean, faith is an enormous gift and an enormous advantage. And that was why I was so keen on it. I'd known Pope Benedict since 1990 because I was a member of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It used to be called the Inquisition. And he was an absolutely brilliant chairman. I've never met a man who was as good at listening to all the argumentation. Everybody in turn, in the 20, 25 people would speak. He would summarize what was said, and then he would analyze it and give his point of view. He was and is an outstanding intellect. He stayed with me. I hosted him at the Sydney Cathedral House. He used to love to correct me when I blustered a bit or got some detail wrong. One of my last visits to him, not the very last, I had a senior moment and couldn't think of the name of some character we were talking about. And as quick as a flash, he came in and provided the name and was absolutely delighted with himself in being able to do that. He's a great writer. He'll be a doctor of the church, of course. I mean, he's a great writer.
From that visit and from your time together with Pope Benedict, do you have an abiding memory, something that sticks out, either from the public ceremonies or the private time you had with him?
I think, yes, him coming up the bay when we were on the bow of the ship. That there's some beautiful shots of that. I mean, Sydney Harbour's an incomparably beautiful place. It was a magnificent setting. I can remember the silence after communion at the final mass. I could hear the birds singing in a crowd of perhaps 400,000. It was a wonderful moment.
Every bride preparing for a wedding at the moment would like to know what you did to get such perfect weather in winter in Australia for that World Youth Day. Did you bury a statue of St. Joseph in the cathedral grounds upside down, or who did you implore for?
We prayed for good weather, and actually those exact days the year before were frightfully cold. It would have been very, very difficult, but God blessed us with good weather. Actually, I think the great surprise, the star for the general public around Sydney, the greatest achievement, the attraction for the Sydney World Youth Day was the young pilgrims themselves. I think so much of non-Catholic Sydney couldn't believe that there were so many wonderful, normal, young, manifestly joyful and good people. The police commissioner said that they restored the faith of his young policemen and policewomen in young people because they weren't wanting to fight the police or abuse them or do anything with them. The role of the police, in fact, was superfluous. And the crime rate, as in, I think, every World Youth Day I knew of, except Rio, the crime rate dropped almost to zero in Sydney.
Your Eminence, there's lots of models for the church and lots of models for ministry and lots of models for youth ministry. I suppose we've been given World Youth Day as a gift from a saintly pastor. Any advice on how we can keep the passion for World Youth Day alive, but also how we can build it into the broader life of our ministry to young people in Australia?
Well, the first thing is to continue to get decent numbers of youngsters to go to it. Certainly, I think it's a good investment to take young teachers, but there's no substitute for impressionable young people like yourself, young 16-year-olds. I can think of a couple of very prominent people in Melbourne who alleged that they were 16 and they were about 13 and a half when they first came on the Melbourne on the Rome Youth Day. Faith is infectious, and if you're present in a great celebration of the Eucharist or the Way of the Cross, you have these moments when we're open to transcendence. When we can feel a little bit more easily that God is with us. And one of the strangest aspects of Western life is that so many people are religiously tone deaf, whereas that World Youth Day it seems to be that people can hear God when He is speaking to them. And then once you've got that, then there's the whole multiplicity of ways and groups. One reason I think why groups like Opus Dei, the Neo-Catechumenal Way, the Manual, they provide the sociological frameworks, supports that help us to maintain and hang on to our faith, which sometimes are a little bit weaker in parishes, where there isn't a decent youth group or the number of young people attending Mass is so small. To hang on to your faith, you need other people around you who share your faith.
Cardinal, you've mentioned about the importance of faith a few times, and how the World Youth Day can provide a real experience of faith. Can I ask, what would be what are one of the ways in which your experience of World Youth Day has deepened your faith personally, and your own experience of God? How has that been affected at different moments in the World Youth Days?
Well, I think that I've mentioned one above all, but this happened on a couple of occasions. The silence at the silence at the Mass. There were hundreds of thousands of young people praying, and that was the same in Spain also. And of course, when other people are manifestly good and people of faith, you remember that solidifies your own faith, that encourages you. From all my priestly life, I've taken strength from the faith of the people with whom I worked. On the other hand, I remember the hissy fit that Satan put on in the vigil in Madrid, when this fantastic storm for 20 minutes or so came down and attacked our gathering. And It was so strong, there was a risk of blowing the whole stage over. So
Yeah.
some very resourceful soldiers who were very, very agile got up and started to cut down the backs of the stage, so it wasn't acting as a sail. The immense number of young people going to confession, of course, is a wonderful, wonderful thing. If any age needs the sacrament of confession or reconciliation, as we call it, surely to God it's ours. It's such a tragedy that it has slipped, although it's much stronger than it was.
Cardinal, there are a lot of pilgrims from that time who went to World Youth Day in year 2000, as well as others who've been to other World Youth Days more recently or even perhaps before, who might be listening to you now. What would be something you'd want to say to them, those who might have been, they might still be strong in their faith, they might be a little bit removed from the life of the church, or they might sort of feel that they haven't had that kind of experience for a long time. What would you want to say to them today, and what sort of message would you give to them?
Well, just remember the good times, and stick with it. Christ has still got the answers. We can't improve on his package, and if we try to, or if we knock off whole slabs of it, there's no wonder that we're not going to do well. There's no guarantee that simply because we're faithful and prayerful, we'll see immediate results. But you can give all sorts of evidence to demonstrate that our social capital is diminishing. The attacks on goodness and on faith are stronger than they were. It's the role of the lay people not to replace the bishops running the church. That's not a Catholic notion at all. We're not Congregationalists. The role of the lay people, according to Vatican II, and the more recent tradition, and it's absolutely congruent with the Gospels, is to take Christ's message out into society, through their families, through your workplace, through the sporting club. You don't have to be ramming anything down anybody's throat, but just courteously, consistently, pleasantly, when it's necessary, witnessing to Christian values. And as the situation gets worse, and it just might, more and more people are going to realise that, and they will be looking for something. They'll be looking for Christ. So we've just got to stick with it, even when they doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah. One of the ways I've heard it beautifully put about the role of the priests and the role of the lay people is the priest's vocation is to sanctify the people, and the people's vocation is to sanctify the world. And that's what Vatican II said, and what you've been saying to us. So if we can really live our vocation as lay people, which the majority of us here are, Father Nick is not, but at the moment, however, we're in Melbourne, we're all in lockdown, and we're kind of like almost living in a monastery or a prison, depending on how your perspective thinks about it. You've had a bit of experience in your own kind of isolation in recent times. What would you say? How would you advise us to live this time of isolation over at least another month? How can we do it in a fruitful way and an effective way, even though we can't go anywhere?
Before I get on to that, and I mean, I've spent 13 months in solitary confinement in jail training for the coronavirus. But before, I think another role for the laity is to support their priests and keep them up to the mark, and the bishops and the cardinals. We need the support of lay people, and sometimes that support also implies a little bit of correction, but we need the lay support because priests can feel realize that the drift is going against us, can feel isolated and feel a bit despondent. Now, what do we do with the corona? The first, I suppose, the first and basic perspective is to acknowledge to ourselves that when we're in a period of suffering or deprivation, we can offer that up to the Lord for a good purpose. So, being stuck at home is not necessarily ideal, although the family loves one another. That provides all sorts of opportunities. But with the no worship and love, I had 4 things at the end: one God, one Redeemer, one church, get with it, 10 commandments. I'd like to see a couple of things added. One about suffering, that we can offer up the suffering, and the other one about the reality of heaven and hell, about reward and punishment after life. But that's another side of things. For people in COVID, you need, or it's very helpful to have a daily routine. Get up at a certain time. Take daily exercise. If you're studying or working, start at a time and do that. If you're able to get out, get out. A change of scenery is, it's stabilizing, reinvigorating. Don't spend all your time watching rubbish TV. There's some good stuff. There's a lot of sport on. I don't know whether Hawthorn's doing very well, but
they weren't doing very well when I left before this interview.
And the other thing, of course, daily, is daily prayer. Now that's, unfortunately, even for a lot of very good Catholics, that's not a habit. But see, when I was in jail, I couldn't say I'm too busy to pray, and so and it's the same with the coronavirus. Now, you don't have to be spending hours in prayer, but 5 minutes or 10 minutes a day reading the scriptures, or saying the rosary, or simply repeating just, Jesus, Son of the living God, have mercy on us. Some little mantra or aspiration, but a period of time every day. And that's psychologically healthy also. So, and don't eat too much, and certainly don't booze too much. These they make it so much more difficult to cope with something like a lockdown.
Your Eminence, I know that one of the real hard points for lay faithful at this time is the absence of the sacraments, the absence of regular attendance at the Mass, the reception of Holy Communion, Eucharistic adoration, and confession. Obviously, when you were in prison, you were unable to celebrate Mass or receive the sacraments with any great regularity. Was there anything in particular that sustained you during that period of time?
Well, I managed to get communion once a week from Sister Mary O'Shaughnessy, who's probably nearly as old as me. She might even be a little bit older, but I mean, who's probably nearly as old as me. She's been working for 25 years as chaplain, does a marvellous, marvellous job. She brought me communion once a week. I had 5 masses, celebrated Father Jerome Santa Maria and Father John McCarthy. Father John McCarthy was my rhetorician's prefect in charge of me when I started as a seminarian in 1960. So we both had a bit of a laugh because he said the authority patterns had reverted to what they'd been with him as a prison chaplain, me as a prisoner, to what they'd been when I was in when I just started. Another to pray in the way that is possible to you, and don't spend too much time lamenting what you can't have. Now, I very much missed celebrating Mass. I certainly missed the celebration of Mass, especially at the great feasts, Christmas and Easter and Pentecost. But you can't do it. You can't do it. You just get on with what you can. And God is with us. God knows what we can and we can't do.
Our restrictions here in Melbourne are a little bit like a yo-yo sometimes. We get forward and backwards, a few steps forward and then a few steps backwards. A bit of your own trial and experience was like that, sort of with the trials and then the appeals and things like that. Did you ever feel like giving up? Did you ever feel overwhelmed by the whole experience? And anything that you'd say to a young person today who might be listening tonight, who's just they've been doing this for months now and they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed? Any advice in that kind of circumstance?
Well, you've got to try to be clear-headed, and you've got to just hang on and keep doing what you know is the right thing. When my appeal was knocked back by 2 judges, and a lot has been written about that, and a lot will, an absolutely remarkable decision. I was a bit tempted to say, look, my friends are going to have to put up another fortune of money to go to the High Court. Why should I cooperate with this expensive charade if the judges were only going to just close ranks and support one another? And the head of the jail he gave me some very good advice. And he said, no, you go ahead with the appeal. He said, Weinberg's dissent is a marvellous basis for that appeal. So similarly with during the lockdown, if you feel like drinking too much, don't drink too much. If you feel like staying in bed till midday, don't stay in bed till midday. Just work out a sensible routine. If you find you're driving other people in the house mad for a percentage of the time, well, take a grip of yourself and stop it, and contribute to just keeping the place on an even keel and contributing to make it happy. That means sometimes biting your tongue, but the ordinary common sense everyday things, you just do the ordinary things, try to do them well. It's easier said than done, I know, but often to make a bit of progress, you just got to keep doing the simple, basic thing.
We're almost all out of time, but all of our guests over the last few months, we've asked one question to wrap up, and that's, is there something that they learnt about themselves during lockdown that they're going to take into their life going forward? So I suppose you're out of lockdown in Sydney now in the COVID sense, but from your experience in prison, was there anything that you learn about yourself that you've taken forward into life now?
I'm tempted to be flippant for a start and to say one of the most disconcerting aspects of the immense number of prayers that were said for me, so I can't recognise any discernible improvement whatsoever. But to be a little bit more serious, I've become more convinced than ever that what the Lord says works. It's true, and it works when you're in trouble. And of course, that's why the church has survived for 2,000 years. There's a marvelous story told about Napoleon. He'd imprisoned 2 popes. When the first pope died imprisoned by Napoleon, Pius VI, Napoleon is supposed to have said, well, that's the end of the church. And I like to think it was a plump little Italian prelate. I don't know what he was, but they say he was Italian. And he said, look, I don't know what you call emperors, sire. He said, we clerics haven't been able to destroy the church in 2,000 years. Don't for a minute think that you're going to be able. And if we stick with what we should be doing, we're always in with a chance. And we've got to remember that at this council thing that they're having. There's got to be a Catholic council. within the apostolic tradition, unity in essentials, courtesy always, we're able to differ, but the basic composition of the church has been handed to us from apostolic times. We are the servants of the apostolic tradition. We're not its masters. We can't dispense with it. We can't turn it upside down. There are no backflips in the development of doctrine. So we've got to remember that we're on a good thing, and just serve it faithfully, not arrogantly or impetuously or with too much sentiment, but just with clear-headed love.
I'd like to thank you very much, Your Eminence. Sorry, Steve?
No, I just said amen.
Amen.
Very good, thank you. It's been great. It's great to go down memory lane. Though we did a few good things, marvellous memories, marvellous people, and some wonderful moments of openness to transcendence, to the good God. Just wonderful, and I'm sure that can be done again and again and again with things like World Youth Day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all you did in those early years in getting World Youth Day put on the national agenda. Obviously for bringing World Youth Day to Sydney, but also just for all you've done for the church and for young people in the church. So thank you, and thanks for joining us this evening down here in lockdown in Melbourne. But thank you for bringing a little bit of joy and happiness into our Sunday night lockdown.
Thanks, Cardinal Pell. Thanks, Father Nick. So great to be here.
So thanks, Steve. We're out of time. We're over time, which we try to avoid doing at any stage. But thank you for being with us. There is a full week of exciting events. Well, I suppose 2 more events after tonight. So Thursday night here at Melbourne Praise, we're going to have a special Thursday night praise from 6:30 till 7:30. An opportunity to pray together for the church and for each other at this time. So please join us for that. And then that will be followed by at 8:30 p.m. via Zoom, a Zoom catch-up for pilgrims who were at World Youth Day. Which is facebook.com/Melbourne Praise. But otherwise, Steve, thanks very much for joining us this evening. And thanks for we thank the Holy Spirit and St. Michael for rectifying our internet issues that we started with, but we got there in the end.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Father Nick.
Cheers.
God bless.
Thanks everyone for being with us. We'll be back next Sunday. God bless.